many Linux users seem to have a general disdain for Windows and Microsoft, which is totally valid. But as for Apple, even though it is considerably more locked down, especially if you include the entire Apple ecosystem, it receives some hate, but nowhere near as much. And I've always been curious why that is the case. So I've been doing a bit of digging around and came across a set of general opinions that might explain why this is the case. This isn't every single possible reason, but this seems to be the general trend. I think the best place to start is with experience. Let me know in the comment section down below, but have you ever actually used a macOS system? And I don't mean using your friend's device once or twice, or using it at a store, just randomly hitting keys, or even using it during like a school computer lab. I mean, it is your device, and you are daily driving it for a couple of months, a couple of years, any reasonable length of time to form your own opinion about whether you like the interface, whether you like the applications, whether you like, the way the store works and how you install stuff. Form your own opinion on how the system actually functions. I have used a macOS system before. I used one for like 3 or 4 years. But I feel like that's the exception. Just going by the Windows market share, it's probably a good guess to say that before you were using Linux, you were daily driving Windows. If you grabbed, let's say, 100 random Linux users and asked them what they were daily driving before Linux, most of them would probably say Windows. This is just a sheer matter of how many people use that operating system. And maybe you're even still in a situation where you dual boot Windows and you have it right at hand. So it's a lot easier to know what you don't like about a system that you are very experienced in using, especially if you're in a situation where you've just recently swapped from Windows 10, Windows 11, or whatever's out when you're seeing this. But to new and old Windows users alike, and especially the people that have experience of both systems, Windows is generally seen as a fairly buggy operating system, especially if you're looking at something like Windows 11, for example. Whereas if we look at an Apple system, even though they may be incredibly locked down, they typically just work. As long as you don't need to physically repair them. That is a whole separate issue. And on those rare occasions where you need to use a macOS system, let's say it's your school computer pool, they generally just feel more polished. The interface may be weird, you may not really understand how everything goes together, but it's not a terrible experience that feels like it's going to collapse under your feet. And besides feeling more polished, macOS provides another benefit. At its core, even though it's got all this fancy stuff on top of it, at its core, it still provides a Unix environment. It is still running ZSH, and you have a terminal there that works like you'd expect a terminal to work on a Linux system. You can run a lot of the same terminal applications, not just those like core utilities, a lot of extra things like Ranger, for example, on macOS perfectly fine. So if you do heavily use the terminal, you don't feel completely lost with what's going on. Whereas over on Windows, yes, you have your DOS prompt, and yes, you have PowerShell, but those feel really weird, especially PowerShell. If you've not used PowerShell, just go and experience it for like 5 or 10 minutes. But Windows does have WSL now, Windows Subsystem for Linux. But with that, you're basically just gluing a Linux virtual machine onto your Windows system, using Linux in Windows, and then it makes the Windows experience better because you ignore the fact that Windows exists. That's a nice thing to have, but I and probably most other people treat that a bit differently from natively having a Unix environment in your system. Then there is the perceived threat of Microsoft. Embrace, extend, extinguish. Anytime they touch anything remotely open source, people worry they're going to make some big modification to it that everybody's going to rely on. They're going to absorb it into their system and then destroy it for anybody else to use. There's also concerns over Microsoft trying to lock down computers, stopping Linux from being installed. The most recent example of this was the Microsoft Pluton chips, where they handled secure boot a bit differently, and by default, distros could not be set up. This was not actually a real concern, it just required a bit of extra tweaking. But anytime something like that happens, it is seen as an attack on open source. So because of that, some people are kinda wary about things that Microsoft are doing. Whereas on the flip side, Apple is very clear about their intentions, and no amount of good PR or user copium is going to change that because they just outright say what they're doing. They want to have a walled garden ecosystem, and they pretty much have it. But with the walled garden, they don't care what's happening outside, and we don't really care what's happening inside. Sure, we'll laugh at something dumb that Apple might be doing here and there, but in the grand scheme of things, it's happening on the Apple hardware. The Apple hardware is completely separate from the hardware you're running Windows or Linux on. So if something bad happens there, it doesn't really matter. And while they don't really try to help anyone, they don't really try to stop it either. See the Asahi Linux project. Nobody is really worried about Apple stopping something in open source or trying to destroy Linux. And on those rare occasions where they do branch out, a lot of the time it's been fairly positive. Back in 2007, Apple purchased and became the main developers of Cups. And till this day, they still use Cups on their system. On the Linux side, there is a fork of it used called OpenCups, but it's still based on that same Apache source code. And Apple doesn't care about Chromium browsers, so they have WebKit. WebKit is what they use to build Safari, but WebKit is also open source, and is used for a bunch of these smaller browsers you see on various Linux distros like the GNOME browser and things like that. And Apple also puts a lot of work into LLVM and Clang. All of these things are generally treated as fairly positive expeditions. Whereas on the Microsoft side, even though nowadays they are a lot more friendly towards open source and a lot more friendly towards Linux, you know, Microsoft loves open source, all that fun stuff, traditionally that was not the case. They did not support open source, not just not support it, they actively did not like it. But a lot has changed since the late 90s and early 2000s, but no matter how much time goes on, as long as the boomers still exist that remember those days, that haze is always going to exist over the company. But in the end, Windows is simply just a bigger target to yell at. Apple doesn't have basically a monopoly on the PC market. They have a lot more market share than Linux does, but that market share is on specific hardware that is designed only to run the Apple software. If people are using that, it doesn't really affect you whatsoever, whereas Linux is competing on that exact same hardware that otherwise could be running Windows. So at this point, calling Microsoft bad is kind of a bit of a sport, and you're always going to be angry at your direct competitor. But let me know your thoughts. Maybe you've always hated Apple more than Windows, maybe you agree, and Windows is generally hated more. I would love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you like this video, I'm going to go and like the video, and if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe, Stanley Pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie on Games. Keep trying to make that mistake. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.